Businesses in Myanmar say the country's economy is on the brink of collapse. Some have seen losses of more than 70% since the military coup, and they believe things will only get worse.
It would be more difficult for international countries to work here if Myanmar is put under sanctions. If that happens, then they will leave Myanmar to maintain their image.
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရဲ့စီးပွားရေးဟာထိလွယ်ရှလွယ်ဖြစ်နေပြီးပြည်ပြင်ပြောင်းလဲမှုတွေနောက်ကျောင်းပြန်နေလို့စီးပွားရေးမျှော်မှန်းချက်တွေအားနည်းနေတယ်လို့ကမ္ဘာ့ဘဏ်ကထောက်ပြပြောဆိုလိုက်ပါတယ်
Earlier this month, Myanmar made it compulsory for all foreign currency in the country's banks to be automatically converted to the local kyat.
During this current crisis, we have been working around the clock to increase our podcast and blog production to the highest possible level, knowing that every little bit counts. However, we're still limited in this effort due to budget constraints. All of our work relies on the power of donation. So if you find this content of value, please consider supporting our mission so that we can continue our efforts.
And welcome back. Our guest today should be familiar to pretty much everyone who's been paying attention to the Myanmar context since the coup. Turnell, a man who should need no introduction, but nevertheless, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself now for the two people in the audience who don't actually know who you are. Sean?
Thank you, mate. My name is Sean Turnell. I've been back in Australia now for about 11 months, but of course, prior to those 11 months, I was a prisoner in Myanmar for 650 days after being sentenced for 3 years, essentially for espionage, although technically I was charged and convicted with breaching Myanmar's Official Secrets Act. But prior to that, I'd been economic advisor to the civilian government in Myanmar from 2016 to 2021. Happened to be in Yangon at the time of the coup, was arrested by the military 5 days after the coup, kept for a while at a police station for about 2 months, locked inside a box, moved into Insane, then up to Naypyidaw, where I was on trial for a year with Dorsu and many of the other ministers. Convicted, as I mentioned, and then finally released in November 2022 and came back to Australia. But yeah, long-time worker on Myanmar, particularly on aspects of the economy, both historically and present day, and as an economist. And since coming back, certainly remain really interested in Myanmar's economic situation and hoping to, contribute as much as I can for as long as I can.
Excellent. It's quite a robust introduction. And now our discussion today is mostly going to focus on the economic, which is your wheelhouse. And so right off the bat, the fact that you were detained essentially under espionage charges when your function was an economic advisor, and you're not even in the government, you're not a Myanmar citizen. You're just an advisor to the people in the government, and yet apparently you had a massive target on your back from the military. So just sort of try to contextualize this for us. Why would someone who is an economic advisor be such a sort of an enemy of the military?
Yeah, two things I think to that, mate. Number one is sort of an instrumental aspect to it, which was I was useful to get at Dorsu and the others. So if they could somehow make out that Dorsu and the other ministers of the NLD government were acting under my direction or collaboration with me, sharing national secrets, things like that, I think they hoped to damage them and hoped and did, of course, then pin charges on them in that way. So I think the first thing is just instrumental as a way of getting to Dorsu and the ministers. So that's number one. I think the second thing, though, is probably a little bit more important in a sense, because the economic reforms that were being undertaken by the NLD government really were beginning to run up against the military and the connected entities all around them. So the whole direction of the reforms was something that the military didn't like and increasingly didn't like. And I think had the second term occurred, that would have been even more apparent. So I think there was a sort of genuine anger there as well from the military that they really were starting to come under pressure from the sort of reforms that we were doing. And I was sort of like a little bit of a bogeyman, I think, for them in that regard. So yeah, so a mixture of those things, instrumental on the one hand, but then a certain animus and a face to put on that animus with respect to the economic reforms themselves.
And so this is a really interesting one because the military, as we know, as we understand, had phenomenal independence under the sort of pseudo democratic governments that we saw, whether it was the government of Thein Sein, whether it was the NLD government. But we often don't think of the economy in that way. I think those of us who are outside, growing up in Western countries, we think of the economy as something that governments, try to manipulate when they can. They try to improve them when they can, but ultimately are beasts completely unfettered and independent and beyond the control of individual institutions and organizations. Now, to what extent did the Myanmar military have control over the Myanmar economy?
To a great extent, but increasingly less so. And I think that was the issue. We often use expressions like transition economy for all sorts of, economies around the world. And it was a label that became popular after the fall of communism, etc. But Myanmar sits right firmly in that camp where it was genuinely transitioning from what in the 1960s was an extreme command economy in which the state and the military is really what we're talking about whenever we use the expression the state in Myanmar, where the military was in complete control, to something else. And so by the time we get to the mid-teens of the 21st century, Myanmar's economy was a mix of things. It still had a large portion completely under state control, and then variations of that leading out to, the informal economy, which is about the only bit that was beyond state control. So it was moving along that continuum, but towards the more economic free end of things. And so it wasn't just the state itself that was beginning to retreat, and a lot of activities that are traditionally done in socialist type countries beginning to move towards the private sector. But even some of the crony conglomerates and some of the military corporations were beginning to find their market share across different areas erode. Now, I don't want to sound too sanguine on that because I'm not saying at all that they didn't have very great control, which they did. And in fact, that's partly what we're talking about, of course, is that ultimately the power thus bestowed bounced back and I think was significant in the coup itself. But they were coming under pressure. So I think it's always important to think of Myanmar genuinely transitioning from something. And that something was complete control. And that, I think, is what the military started to glimpse a possible future in which their control was eroding.
Because you mentioned this transitioning, and I think it can be a little bit confusing to follow because there seem to have been multiple transitions in the Myanmar economy. I think um, the creation of this socialist state. I mean, if we can take it that far back, um, was there a period in Myanmar where they tried to do what we saw in a lot of other socialist states like China and the USSR, where you just simply did not have private enterprise as such. Was that ever an objective of the regime?
Yeah, it sure was. Yeah. So in the early years of the Burma Road to Socialism, that's exactly what they had in mind. And we saw a nationalisation of economic activity that went just about further in Myanmar than any other country, apart from, again, the other really extreme examples like North Korea and so on. So, yeah, it really reached large scale and yeah, almost complete by the time we get to the late 1960s. Then in the early 70s, it starts to move off a bit, and then we get some big changes then happening towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, the Thein Sein government, and so on. So the direction really from the late 1980s is a gradual retreat of formal state control. But again, really important to acknowledge that um, less than formal state actors begun to fill some of the gap as well, whether it be crony conglomerates or military-owned corporations. But yeah, but at one point it really was the full Stalinist state control
And
model.
it's interesting because the stories that we hear from the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s are ones in which the military themselves, not the high level generals, but the officers who received certain goods, like actual goods, as part of their compensation, selling those goods on street corners to make ends meet, and people who don't have access to those types of commodities, or at least not sort of reliable access to those commodities, whether it's petrol, whether it's rum, um, engaging in a black market economy. So was there a sense of the military establishment trying to create a completely regulated and controlled economy, while simultaneously the military themselves being the main drivers of the illicit, unofficial economies on the side?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've put your finger on it actually, which was the military at one level, again, back to that earlier period in the 1960s, sought almost complete state control. That model didn't work, and so we moved to something else, and essentially to shore up its own power and to, uh, I guess, make sure that people went along with their control of the economy. We see Myanmar's economy moving almost completely to a rent-seeking one. So the military's role is to really grab the commanding heights of the economy, but then, as you've mentioned, all the way down through the system as well, and that distribution of rents or distribution of economic benefits that come not through economic activity, but just simply power over resources, that becomes the essential feature of Myanmar's economy. I'd say over the last 50 years of just grabbing control of the country's resources, distributing those resources to favoured entities in larger amounts at the top of the pyramid, the crony firms and all that, but then all the way down to the bottom. So it's about grabbing control of the state. Whoever controls the state controls the economy. But yeah, so it sort of changes a little bit through time, but that essential essence of Myanmar really being a rent-seeking economy rather than the sort of economy that was fast developing around the rest of the Southeast Asia, becoming the tigers, becoming productive economies. Myanmar's was never really about that. It was all about just grabbing control, whatever there was, and distributing that in order to maintain power, basically.
So, I mean, I'm not an economist, so forgive me if I'm incorrect in my characterization. But when you talk about rent seeking as a economic idea or ethos, it sounds very much to me, as a layman, what I would simply describe as scamming off the top. So not actually contributing new goods, new commodities to the economy, but rather taking things that already exist, taking control of those things, and trying to artificially inflate the prices and the values of those things so that you can line your own pockets, while again not actually contributing to the overall production of the economy as a whole. Is that a accurate description of what's going on?
I think it's magnificently accurate. That's exactly what we're talking about. Yep.
So that can an economy in such a structure succeed? Can it grow? Is there any long-term plan for that?
No, no, it essentially can't grow. It's only going to grow through population growth, and then whatever can be brought in around the edges from outside. And again, that's really the essence of the story of Myanmar's economy over the last few decades. We've seen the other countries become leaders in export industries and so on, and with a very firm idea about where they want to go and what to do to get there. In Myanmar's, yes, there's been improvements around the edges of, technologies have been brought in and so on. And so we've seen some economic growth and, again, some population growth that's going to inflate the economy anyway. But other than that, we've not seen anything like the transformational change that we saw in other parts of Asia. And the reason for that, again, really comes down to the political. Essentially, what it was about, as you've described, is just grabbing hold of that pie and carving that pie up. It was never about how can we make a bigger pie. That was never really the central question of economic decision makers in Myanmar for much of the last half century.
And so I couldn't forgive myself if I had an economist on and I didn't go there. So if we can spend a moment talking about 1985 and 1987, when General Ne Win basically unilaterally abolished most of the high value currency notes in the economy and thereby erased most common people's life savings. Can you speak at all to what was going on in the minds of the leadership when they made that phenomenally disastrous decision, and what the actual economic impacts of that were?
Yeah, so again, that really comes out from a fear of loss of control. So the specifics there were essentially that a lot of black market activity was being taken place in cash. In fact, particularly then, it was exclusively cash, and it was seen as a way of hitting back at that part of the economy completely out of the control of the state. So again, at that period, the failure of the full socialist model was in full bloom. And there was this burgeoning informal economy, which the state had very little impact over. But the one thing that they did have control over, of course, was the basic currency unit within which most of that activity took place. So the idea was if you demonetized the most important currency notes in that system, it was a way of bringing down that formal economy and, in a sense, reasserting state control. So that's essentially what it was, but of course it was very strange on top of that. So as we know, part of that story was the replacement of a decimal currency system into one based on the number 9 and all the rest of it. So it's sort of infamous amongst demonetization episodes around the world because of its bizarre numerical aspects. But in many other ways, it's sort of a very typical thing, actually done by totalitarian regimes in particular, as a way of sort of pushing back against elements that are starting to get out of beyond the control of the state.
Fascinating. And so, I mean, just what actually happened then? Because people lost life savings. Like the initial wave that was done in 1985 eliminated, if I remember correctly, the 50 and the 100. And that's what most people were keeping their savings in. Those were the highest value currencies. Did the people themselves try to find alternatives? Did they try to find ways of, I don't know, move to a different currency? Did they lose faith in the banks, or did they start relying more on the military infrastructure? Did it succeed in a sense in shutting down the black markets? What was the reaction?
No. Yeah, no. So the first thing is that it didn't work at all. And so people just moved into other assets absolutely beyond state control. So into gold and physical commodities and into foreign currencies to the extent that they could. Also, though, the damage on the economy was so severe that some of the people, of course, never recovered the resources that they had before the demonetization episode. So, in other words, it wasn't that they replaced that money with anything, they just didn't have anything. And then the economy entered a period of a great shock to productivity. So it wasn't like, that there was lots of wealth looking for a new way of storing that wealth. A lot of that wealth just simply disappeared. But you used an expression a moment ago, which is really important to highlight whenever we talk about money, which is the word faith. That's the critical word, because the most important thing that demonetization episode did, and then it's been backed up again and again and again in Myanmar, is a loss of faith in the monetary unit. And when we think about the monetary unit or money, we're talking about the most important institution there is in a country, because we work for money, we save in money, we survive through money. It's the blood of the system. But if you bring doubt into that, then suddenly people no longer work for money, save for money, use the national monetary unit to buy, sell, invest, and all that sort of thing. Instead, economic activity gets diverted into just defensive ways of keeping the state at bay. Uh, Again, nothing can be trusted. Investment takes a huge hit, and you just start doing all the things you need to do to protect yourself, rather than those longer punts in the future that requires a stable currency unit. So when we think in the 21st century about the innovations of the big tech firms and internet entrepreneurs and all that around the world, notice that all of that is founded upon some sort of faith in the monetary unit. If you're going to put money out there with an expectation of return, but then find out that that return is itself in doubt because the most fundamental institution, money itself, is in doubt, then economic activity just begins to freeze up. The entire economic system really becomes perverted. And so that episode, I think, just lay the floor and then the groundwork to what would be subsequent decades of similar sorts of moves, of which I would say the coup and some of the things that have happened since are more examples of it.
Mhm. So then moving forward after that absolute debacle, um, something that we're going to come back to because it seems to have many elements of that are repeating themselves today, and definitely the loss of faith in the chat is something that's been going on since the restrictive currency measures they took in 2021. But so moving forward, the military then knows ahead of time that they want to have the veneer of democracy. They want to open up the country, at least in a PR sense, and so they privatize. They privatize a lot of the industries of the nation into MEC and MEHL, which they somehow still control. Can you explain what is going on? Because we hear MEC, MEHL again and again and again and again. They keep popping up in everything. What are they really?
Well, I would say that they're more socially acceptable or internationally acceptable, if you like, means of doing the same thing as before, which is just divvying up the rents. But you do it in different ways that make it seem perhaps almost on the surface of a bit of reform, even, but again, just superficially rather than in actual fact. But you're right in that I think what the military was trying to do, of which the creation of MEC and MEH, or their transformation into what they become, is an example of, which is again some sort of superficial demonstration that that the military understand that the economy was important. They needed to pull back in that really obvious Stalinist sort of sense, come up with something else, but not do anything too much to endanger those flow of rents. And so I think we see MEC and MEH just come out of that, this desire to present a country perhaps under reform, and possibly some of the, well, not possibly, I think probably some of the military officers did genuinely have an idea about reforming the economy anyway. Not perhaps for good reasons, but just simply because they wanted Myanmar to become a more productive place and become wealthier, and they would advantage from that as well themselves, of course, and Myanmar would be a more powerful voice in the world if it wasn't as poor as it was. So I think there was also a bit of recognition that some in the military thought that, okay, we've got to change things. The old complete state control model doesn't work. Let's try out some other things. Let's have a look at what's going on in the rest of Asia. And they would have seen some countries beginning to make economic progress, even in the absence of political progress. So I think there was a little bit of trying to copy that sort of model. But yeah, I would see MEC and MEH coming out of that as an example of the appearance of giving up state control, while not in any way giving up the distribution of rents.
And so on a more strict technical level, who actually owns MEC and MEHL? Is it a series of individual military commanders? Is it their friends, or is it the military as an entity that owns it?
Well, the first thing we'd have to say with both of those is that they're an utter black box. They remain certainly a black box uh, to someone like myself during the period of NLD government, but likewise to many others in the government as well. Now, in saying that, I don't want to suggest that there could have been some people who would have made some big inroads in understanding those two institutions, but if there were, I didn't know any. It Yeah, that they are units that remained under the control of the military. Little tidbits of knowledge would come here and there, but their ownership, even their ownership, is quite extremely mysterious. That they were originally set up to provide funds for the sort of quartermaster associations and were meant to benefit fairly regular ranks of the military. But I don't think there's any question that those entities are controlled by much higher elements. They're not in any way mutual associations or anything as innocuous as that. So they remain very much in control of powerful figures within the military and the broader military state. But the exact I think configuration of the power structure within them certainly is something that I never knew. Even though, again, you certainly get the impression that powerful interests in the military controlled them, and I guess why I'm sounding doubtful about the exact structure of them. I think it was very interesting. For instance, the question of to what extent were these owned by current leaders of the military as opposed to past ones, and so on. So there was a lot of grey around things like that.
So we don't actually know. We just have a sense that these two massive entities that basically just own most of the businesses in the country are definitely in some way controlled by and funding the military, but we don't fully understand the mechanisms of that.
I think in the case of those two institutions, that's right. There was some wonderful work being done on all of this around in the early 2000s by some great Myanmar researchers and so on. But it sort of came to an end when various publishers and so on got cold feet. But so there had been some inroads in it, but the secrecy of these institutions, of course, is for a reason. So cracking them open is never going to be easy. But also just getting confirmation of information from them both is likewise extraordinarily difficult.
I can imagine. And do we have an estimate for like how much of the economy is actually in their hands?
No, not really, except a sizable chunk. Little rule of thumbs, like up to about 20% was something that I used to carry in my head. But whether that was true or not, just really, really difficult to quantify. So much of even apart from MEC and MEH, so much of what the military does in the economy is under their own, well, within that black box that I mentioned. So yeah, and any sort of precision on numbers, I think, is a bit of a fool's errand in some ways.
Good to know. But nevertheless, so we're in this situation now where the military, in whatever way, but apparently lawfully, put that in inverted commas, owns a huge slice of the economic pie, and they've got this notional democratization. They've started to see increased acceptance internationally. The country is opening up, and under the Thein Sein era and under the NLD era, it seems that there was actually genuine investment into the country, and there seems that there was genuine economic growth and development of that economy. Can you sort of try to quantify how much the economy was changing and developing during that period?
Yeah, so I think quite substantially, and again, this gets back to that original point that I mentioned, that so much so that I think the military started to fear that its control was being rapidly eroded. But yeah, it sort of began by something that I hinted at earlier, that there were elements within the military regime that understood that Myanmar was slipping further and further behind other countries, and this would become a longer term problem, and that spectre of Myanmar just disappearing into becoming a province of China, I think was becoming a very real threat. So we see as the 2000s go on, a bit of an understanding that change needed to happen, and particular a hope, I think, of many in the military that maybe they could open the economy without opening the politics too much, that they could enjoy faster economic growth, have a bit of a transformation of the economy, increase wealth all round, get their cut and so on, and move Myanmar to a better place. And that I think is sort of the vision of the Thein Sein government, is my reading of it, that what they were looking at were the sort of authoritarian models in much of the rest of Southeast Asia. So yeah, it was never, in my view, about democracy or anything like that, but it was about, I think, opening up enough freedom on the economic side to rapidly improve growth, but always with a view of benefiting themselves. And so so they opened a lot to foreign investors and all that, but that was always very tightly controlled. And so in exchange for entry would come all sorts of partnerships, sometimes with MEC and MEH, by the way, but sometimes otherwise as well. Sometimes just, favourable decisions given to particular cronies in exchange for kickbacks along the way. But nonetheless, delivering growth, but yeah, alongside that, a lot of benefits to the military as well. And so that, again, as I say, is to me the sort of thing we saw through the Thein Sein government. Changed it a little bit along the way. I think as time went on, there were parts that some of the economic ministers of that time were probably going further than the military really wanted. And I think we saw that in lots of tensions within the USDP and other groups around that time. Then the NLD come in, and to my way of thinking and to my experience, I think the vision was very different. It was still about moving along, opening Myanmar's economy, etc., to drive growth and to actually allow Myanmar to catch up to some of its peers and neighbours in Asia. But to me, there was always a very, very strong political economy aspect to it as well, which is that you could make political change to get economic change, but also economic change could actually lead to political change. And I think probably the most powerful statement of this was the most important economic document of the NLD government, which was the so-called Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, or MSDP. And if you have a look at that, there's a very powerful declaration of the interactions between economics and democracy in both directions. That good economics was good for growth and all that, but it was also about opening the economy up. It was about dispersing economic power, and by dispersing economic power, that there would be a dividend politically to that. You would actually begin to dilute some of those really powerful instruments that had controlled Myanmar's economy for such a long time. That had included the military, but it included a lot of the powerful groups connected to them as well. And that you'll get a virtuous circle was the hope. That you would get economic change leading to more change of the fundamental political economy, which would then beget further economic change, further political change, etc. And that's the trajectory that certainly the people I worked with, that was their firm belief. And I think it's very nicely set out in that MSDP. So, so a little bit of continuity, I think narrowly just in terms of economic or greater economic liberalisation under the Thein Sein government, then into the NLD. But the NLD, my view would be that narrow economic part of their objectives was greatly accelerated, but it also had that political economy dimension as well.
Now, so one thing that you've mentioned quite a few times is the cronies. And again, we have a general understanding of what cronies are, but they seem to have a very particular role to play within the economic and political spheres in Myanmar. How would you categorize and define a crony? What makes a businessman a crony?
Well, a crony you would really define as someone who makes money by proximity to power. So, in other words, a lot of their wealth comes from that expression that we've used again and again, that is simple rent seeking. So, it might be an entity that gets a monopoly license, say, to import motorcycles, or be the exclusive exporter of cane sugar, or have some sort of special import rights over fuel or motor vehicles or buses or tractors or whatever it is. So in other words, you get some sort of exclusive right given by the state, and then invariably there'd be some kickbacks along the way. So the relationship between the crony and the government is utterly symbiotic. But the largest part of the wealth, it's important to note, again, is not really coming from innovation or entrepreneurial activity or putting your money at risk. It's usually about just carving out some sort of space. So I think in Myanmar's case, that's primarily what we're talking about, but that's not to deny that there was a little bit of entrepreneurial activity as well, usually funded by the rent-seeking activities. So if we look at some of the major conglomerates, what you usually find is that there's some initial way in which they earn their money, say, teak extraction and exports, something like that. But then that money is then funneled back into some sort of other activity, property development, construction, an airline. And then once you've got all that up and running, you usually want to open a bank as well to be able to distribute some of this largesse and curry further favour with powerful interests, both in the government and amongst your fellow cronies. So you sort of get it galloping ahead from there. But yeah, I think the important thing about the cronies, and we can see it almost crony by crony, you'll find some sort of monopoly, semi-legal activity that kicks the process off, that's protected by the state, and then a sort of broadening out. But very often at its heart remains a sort of protected economic activity. And it's also why, I mentioned that I think the military felt under threat as the reforms were going on under the NLD government. But I think many of the cronies were as well, because I think a lot of their businesses were starting to face much stiffer competition. But yeah, so whichever way we're talking about, when we think about, I think, the political economy in Myanmar that was developed, it really is a story of protected entities.
So would it be fair to say that the fundamental distinction between a crony and a successful businessman is that the cronies would rely more on nepotism, corruption, and special legal exemptions and protections to run their businesses, and therefore that the cronies would also be funneling wealth back to the people in positions of power who are protecting them?
Yep, I think that's a really accurate description of it.
Okay, and so you're saying that these are monopolies that they're running. How common is sort of monopolistic activity and other types of business structures and business activities that are generally considered to be non-competitive or outright illegal in Western economies?
Yeah, very common. So we've mentioned monopoly, but then, as you've mentioned as well, illegal activities. So in other words, they're the sort of activities that you don't have to worry about some big foreign company coming in and doing, just simply because that company, probably from regulators back home, would forbid them getting involved in it. So so it's some sort of activity. It might be. So when we say monopoly, it might be, say, a regional monopoly. So you might have, an exclusive import license for motorcycles in, say, Karenni state or in the Delta or in Shan state or whatever. So you can actually have the same activity, but regionalised monopolies. And so, so it needn't even be a nationwide monopoly. Or again, it can be an illegal activity which is protected by its very nature, because there's a lot of other business entities that just can't participate. So so that's the sort of activity that we're talking about, which great wealth can be assembled.
And so it just seems like there's evolved this symbiotic relationship between a corrupted corporatist class who are protected by the leadership, and therefore a corrupt leadership who are willing to sell out the nation's economy to their corporate friends, and that this is just a feedback loop, and it just stops anything from working, because nobody would want to invest in a country like this, and nobody can really get big in a country like this because the protected monopolies are going to ensure that you can't compete with them. So did this just enforce to a large degree, did this slow the progress of the economy even during the Thein Sein era?
Yep, sure did. Yep, and that's what makes economic reform in countries like Myanmar just so difficult, because you're confronting vested interests all the way. Not only within the cronies themselves, not only within the military, but of course within the civil service and so on as well, where you've got all of this going on too. Lots of corruption there, huge vested interests just right across the entire political economy, and it just makes things um, insanely difficult. And so, but I guess the tactic then is to try and do it quickly if you can,
Mm.
to disperse power quickly enough that you can actually set up other centers of power. You start to get countervailing power interests, and that's really the rub of economic reform, is to try and get those benefits of reform out there quickly enough and in significant magnitudes enough that other people then have a vested interest in favour of reform rather than resisting it. So, but it just means that it's all incredibly difficult when you've got a structure like Myanmar has now.
And so that I think segues us very, very neatly into the meat of it. Now that we've understood the context and the history of the economy and the corruption of the economy, what is it that under the NLD government, um, you and your colleagues were able to actually do? Because the NLD government's power was very hypothetical in a lot of cases. The military time and again showed that they don't actually take seriously the idea of a civilian government getting in the way of their interests. So what was actually at the disposal of the government and the infrastructure of the day to reform the economy?
Well, it was just to move on as wide a front as possible and do what you can when you can. Myanmar is one of those places where grand plans just don't work. Um, in fact, actually, there's not many countries that grand plans work anyway. Life is too messy. But yeah, a very broad front to try and reform things as much as you can, when you can, as often as you can, and hope for sort of spin-offs from that to begin to reform other areas. One of the things about reform, once you start to really get going, is that the disruptive process itself can become quite productive. Disrupting one part of the economy requires disruption in another, and so on. And then you start to build coalitions and other interests in favour of reform, as I mentioned. So the hope was that if you could get really things going along, that you would be able to get enough incentives out there to bring other people along with you, and that the whole motivation for a great many people across the economy would be to keep those reforms, and I mean, I'll get onto some of the division or some of the resistance to that in a tick, but just to say, we could see that there were moments of clarity and optimism where you saw particularly young people grabbing ideas that were locally generated or seeing things that were happening overseas, and people in Myanmar coming up with things themselves or sometimes coming back from overseas and just running with them, and there was, I think, from about the mid 2010s, around 2015, 2016, etc., a real building momentum of new businesses, new ideas, and invariably young people. So you could see it. The promised land was almost there, if I could if I could say that. But against all of that were all those vested interests that I mentioned, and the NLD government just hit so many roadblocks. I mean, the most obvious one and ever threatening one was the military. So it's sitting there as a presence all the time and issuing vague threats, which I'm not sure how many people can remember, but Min Aung Hlaing and others within the military were constantly sending shells over over the rigging of the NLD government. But even apart from that, the bureaucracy itself, of course, had been built up to serve originally this Stalinist state and then this rent-seeking state that we've been talking about. So the bureaucracy was extraordinarily resilient against change, resistance against change, and resilience, resilient, I suppose. And so one of the biggest barriers was not even just the very obvious resistance of the military, but the passive and sort of just background resistance of the public sector. So it was incredibly difficult to get things done, get things through. I would say that, much of the bureaucracy in Myanmar was sclerotic. And so, it was just hard to get anything through. Um, and I think, we'll probably touch upon this later, I guess, but, if one was to look forward, one of the first things a reformist government should probably do, with the lesson of the NLD's experience in mind, was the first thing was to, really clear out that civil service. But yeah, so all just extremely difficult. And it just became a process then of trying to attack points for reform on multiple fronts. And again, I would draw people's attention if they, because it is still exists online, that Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan. You'll see from that just the wide range of liberalisation measures from every area we could think of. But it wasn't grand planning. It was literally just about opening things up here, there, and everywhere. Just little explosions of freedom, if you like, was meant to sort of kick things off. And I do think, that there was a great deal of progress on that. And again, that's what partly inspired the full-on resistance to it.
And so this is where it gets into like a weird territory, because you said before that the Thein Sein government was trying to improve the economy selfishly. They wanted to improve their own lot in life, but they recognized that they needed a stronger economy for there to be more economy to scam off the top of. And so
Yeah.
when you have the scale of investment in Myanmar, and you have these Western companies coming into Myanmar and creating new opportunities and creating employment and improving the strength of the economy, that presumably would also have benefited the landed, established economic heavy hitters who would be best positioned to be able to exploit these new opportunities. But it would also, one presumes, have threatened the monopolies they'd spent a long time establishing. What was going on with the cronies in this time? Were they seeing a net benefit as a result of this expansion of the economy, or were they seeing their fiefdoms worn away?
Yeah, so they were seeing both, which I think is exactly the point you're making there. So yes, they would probably have seen that in the longer term they were going to be smaller fish in a bigger pond. So in a sense, the choice for them was that they were enormous fish in a tiny, tiny pond, and they could see the limits of that. So I think there was an idea that the pond needed to grow, but a recognition that they would become relatively smaller fish but bigger absolute fish, just to continue the metaphor further, so that that they would become wealthier by a wealthier Myanmar. But at the same time, their absolute control over the particular industries they were in would begin to weaken. So, and I think that, by the way, is something you see economic reform everywhere. The point you make is absolutely right. People with money and power will always benefit from reform, but the key is so will others. And over time, one would hope that those others, and I think we saw evidence of that in Myanmar, as we have everywhere around the world, that over time, those old vested interests begin to be, well, not so much competed away, but a certain countervailing power tends to uh, erode some of the dominance of those players. So yeah, that's sort of the story, I think. Just to reiterate too, though, I think there were elements in the Thein Sein government that were not completely selfish. I think again the state objectives I think were quite narrow and were absolutely about this dark vision that they were beginning to see of Myanmar just slipping off all sorts of global indexes of power and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think there was some with a bit of a broader vision as well.
Interesting. And so then the next corollary, if it is economic expansion, foreign investment, reform that allows these cronies to see their own bank account numbers go up, basically, whether or not they own the show, they themselves now have more purchasing power than they did previously. Does this wear away at the symbiotic relationship between the cronies and the military that had previously propped up their economic prosperity?
Yeah, very much so. And I think we saw that without mentioning any names. But I think if we look at, there were certain crony businesses that had developed quite strong ties with international firms with very strong governance requirements. And we were beginning, I think, to see a transformation. And we saw that in banking, we saw it in airlines, we saw it in hospitality, we saw it in insurance, telcos, all sorts of things like that. I think that there was real change taking place. And so that symbiotic relationship, which had been the critical relationship before, was beginning to change, where, in a sense, if you like, the stakeholders for some of those crony businesses became different. You know, the people they answered to, apart from themselves and their owners and all the rest of it, but beyond that, it wasn't just the military anymore. It was other entities, and sometimes those entities were offshore and beyond control of the Myanmar military. So, yeah, so I think there was a fundamental change between some of the cronies and the military as well. And I think, again, around the time of the coup and post-coup, we've seen some of that. We've also seen the opposite, of course. We've seen some of the cronies who, in a sense, were beyond the pale, beyond investable by international investors. And I think some of those, they stayed much closer to the military, both through the NLD period and after.
I mean, so that makes sense. So there's a sort of bifurcation of the crony population into those who see a future for themselves and their interests in the new system, and those who know that their only hope to maintain their power is to drag the country back into the old system.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think post-coup as well, we've seen some of the ones that had made progress and had moved further away from the military in what are just acts of desperate survival, just heave back to the military again. One of the things, because I don't want to sound too um, naive about business, by the way, here, in that there's a wonderful line that basically just says capital is always cowardly, right? So money always flees. It always flees trouble. So we've certainly seen that after the coup, that enterprises that had seemed to be the sort of enterprises that Myanmar might need in the future, when push came to shove and the military came back, a lot of them, really showed the colours of capital so often through history and just went back to where power lay.
Mm, that makes sense. And so, on top of this, you've mentioned a couple of times the civil service. So my understanding is that many of the high-ranking positions within the civil service sector actually were held by military officers, former military officers, the family and friends of military officers, and of course, as we know, under the 2008 Constitution, I think 4 of the ministry portfolios outright had to be controlled by military-appointed government ministers. So, to what extent were the people working in the civil service personally beneficiaries of this corrupted relationship between the military and the cronies? And how difficult was it to get the civil service to get rid of these people who are trying to hold the country back from development without suffering too much institutional knowledge loss?
Yeah, a great question, which I'll break up into about 3 parts if I
By all
can.
means.
Two, two to start with, and so one is to say that many in the civil service were exactly as you've described, super connected to the rent flows coming from the military. And you mentioned, senior military people being put in very powerful positions within the civil service, so that they were very obvious points of resistance to change, and overtly so, and crudely so. So that's one group. A second group, though, would really just come from the mindset of the civil service, because again, this civil service grew up. It was established through very strong state socialist sort of control. Begins to loosen up, but it's still very much a rent-seeking economy. It really is wealth comes out of your access to the state. And so the mindset, if you like, of the civil service is likewise, I think, quite a powerful cultural thing in governing how people behave. And so breaking out of that, so in other words, moving from a presumption that everything is forbidden unless the state allows it, to the reverse, that everyone should basically be free to do things, in the economic sphere particularly, unless for some reason, it should not be permitted. That mindset change was absolutely crucial and very much a work in progress. And when I say a work in progress, really only the first tiptoe into that. So so within the public service itself, I think you've got those two elements: very overt corruption and overt connection of very powerful people to military and other interests, but then this broad, I would say, cultural problem within the civil service. And by culture, I mean work culture, fashioned by incentives down the years, of just knowing how to get ahead within the civil service. But again, based on a fundamental idea as well, is that it's up to the state to give permission to do things, and without that permission, something was forbidden. And so, trying to overturn that, trying to make the presumption that people were free to do things unless there was some good health or whatever other reason for them not to do it. That was a real battle, and I think partly generational as well, because I think an elephant in the room in this aspect, in talking about cultural change within the civil service and so on, is also just looking at the age structure and some of the dynamics of the way in which so much of the civil service was dominated by, and if I speak it frankly, old men. Old men who had grown up under a different system and were just highly resistant to change, whether or not they were in the pay of a particular crony or connected to the military or not. They had a nice little comfortable niche in these jobs, and just didn't want to change. And so one of the things I observed and I admired them incredibly was the young people who'd come into the civil service and come into sort of policy making roles. I admired them for their ambition, for their vision, for their courage and all that. But I sort of lamented with them the frustration that they had of trying to bring about change. And they made victories here and there, but it was just so hard. And I'd particularly like to call out actually women, young women in this process, because Myanmar has one unusual big picture cultural aspect when it comes to economic ministries, and that is they tend to be dominated by women at the working level. At the top, it's these old men who tend to run the places and make the decisions. But if you look at who does the work, it's mostly women. And who was doing the work and driving the change? It was mostly young women. I was lost in admiration within weeks of getting to Myanmar and taking up my role in 2016. And that admiration lasted all the way to the end and beyond. It's just so tragic to think that these young women are often, have had to flee or whatever, or worse, etc. Now. So there's that aspect then, just about the civil service. The other point, the third point I wanted to make, that your question prompted, if I can, is just to say, was just to highlight the point you made, that very powerful ministries were beyond control of the civilian government. And I think this is absolutely critical. It's critical in so many ways, politically, but it's critical economically as well, because when you think about it, what a remarkable thing that here you've got a government trying to reform, trying to, say, fix up the fiscal situation and all that, but that the biggest area of government spending, the far and away most important fiscal unit, home affairs, military, are totally beyond the civilian government to influence. And in the case of the military, its budget could not even be questioned by the parliament and by the civilian government, let alone determined by that government. So the biggest area of government spending was beyond the control of the government. And so that meant that if you're talking about fiscal reform, the biggest single item of your influence is off the table from the word go. And so you've got to come at things from different angles. And I think that's a very important hurdle that existed all the way through the NLD government and unresolved, of course, right to the end, because the military never did give that up. And of course, the coup is just a further assertion of their control in that and so many other ways.
And so, first of all, I just want to echo what you were saying about, in particular, the young Myanmar women. Um, I was having a discussion with one of our other guests, who I won't name because we were speaking off the record, and I found it very interesting because I expressed a position that was very critical of a lot of the entrenched labor and entrenched mindsets within Myanmar industries and specifically Myanmar government sectors. And he was pushing back, but eventually we got to a point where he would basically say, okay, if we really wanted to improve these organizations, probably we would start by getting rid of everyone who's over the age of 45, and of the people remaining, get rid of 75% of the males and 25% of the females, because on the whole, young women are the people that you want in these industries. They're the ones that you want in these government sectors because they are the ones who are going to work the hardest, and they are the ones who are the most open to new things and new experiences and change, and are going to help implement things that are beneficial, even if they go against the way everything has been done up until now. So you're certainly not the first person that we've had on the channel who's expressed this admiration for the incredible capacity of Myanmar women, particularly young Myanmar women, and lamented that they are very often just overlooked and ignored, and very often have had to flee the country, which is a very sad situation to be in. But
Yeah, it's I don't want to be too down on the men in that, there were some really great guys as well, but yeah, the broader point, it's a generalization that works. And just another little anecdote on that, whenever I would go into a meeting, you'd always see the men at the top table, and then you would see the women always in the seats at the back, like lining the walls, sitting there with their pens poised, and but if you ever wanted to know anything, it was to the women that you went all the time. And this was just a pattern right across the whole time I was there. So yeah, just another anecdote, I guess, in that same direction. But at the same time, just a little bit of a shout out to my many Myanmar male friends, many of whom were great as well. But as a general rule, I think we can say that the women were just superlative.
oh, absolutely. And so moving to the comments you made with the military budget, there's an interesting factoid that I came across a while ago. I just want to run past you. Right after the coup happened, a friend of mine and I, we were doing some back of the envelope calculations on how much money the military is going through, and trying to figure out, well, how long can the military sustain um, the CDM basically, and the economic shutdown that comes with people refusing to go to work and refusing to raise revenue or the rents that the military requires. And one thing that I came across when I was trying to find the military budget was that apparently not only does the military get its budget during the actual annual budget announcement, it gets that allotment, but there's a tradition where the military can basically come back 6 months later and will put in a request for an extension of budget, which is just rubber stamped through the government pro forma. And so you might have a budget of whatever the case may be, and then you might have 25-50% increase on that budget 6 months down the line. Is that also your experience?
Absolutely. Yep. And there's even something beyond that, which is off the book financing for the military. So the issue that you referred to is still on book. It's still vaguely observable. There was some sort of process. But one important fact we always have to remember is that the military has control of the printing presses for the money. So push comes to shove, and this is where it's interesting with Myanmar. Sometimes the economic questions are incredibly basic. In countries like the United States, etc., you've got the Federal Reserve, you've got, we're witnessing at the moment, the US government might be shut down because of spending bills stuck in the Congress and all the rest of it. None of that in Myanmar. In the end, push comes to shove, the military print the money. Now, massive damage comes from that. You get monetary instability, which is one of the features of Myanmar down the last few decades, all come from that feature, but they can do it. So when it comes down to their resources, as long as the domestic currency has some sort of claim over real resources, it can be used to get stuff for them, basically, putting it really bluntly and crudely. As long as it has some value, that access to the print is really the foundation to the military's financing operations. And so, and the control of the printing works has been absolute throughout. All sorts of skullduggery happens when it comes to money printing in Myanmar down the years. So so just to say that in a very visceral, physical way, the military has access to finance that is just completely obscure to anyone, and solely available to them and outside any sort of scrutiny, any sort of control of any outside
So
party.
I just need to clarify, because what you've just said is a level of insanity that I did not expect to be the case. Are you telling me that the military actually has seigniorage, the actual literal right to create new banknotes without having to get approval from civilian government?
Most certainly.
That's
Yep.
do they have to report it
Without
at least?
No,
So
no, there's nothing that they have to do. Now, sometimes it will be reported, but at other times, not at all. There are many instances over the last few decades of multiple printings of a currency run. So, for instance, you might get authorization, here at the official level, you might get authorization through the central bank to print, say, 1 billion 10,000 JAT notes, just off the top of my head, and they'll be allocated a certain serial run. Well, you could do a duplicate of that printing. So you could even keep the numbers consistent with what the original authorization might be. But in the end, there's still a physical story here. There's the physical production of notes. So regardless what's been authorized and entered into the books, even literally in a most basic level in terms of the serial numbers on the notes, you could do a duplicate printing of those same notes and use those notes in circulation. And in a country like Myanmar, you're going to get away with it because, again, the military is the ultimate authority and it answers only to itself and to no one else. So, and it's why, of course, we have this other very bizarre phenomenon in Myanmar where the true limit then, according to the finance of the military, is twofold. Number one, the complete collapse of confidence in the JAT, but of course, even well short of its complete collapse, declining confidence in the JAT undermines military spending. So even as they print like crazy, they're simultaneously reducing the value of the JAT as they're doing that. That's one aspect. But the other one, again, even more basic and just extraordinary limit to military financing is that they start to wear out the printing presses. Like literally, the plates that are used to print the image on those banknotes wear out. And there's been many times in Myanmar where the printing process itself, the physical printing process, has become the problem, and parts can't be accessed from Germany, where originally the note printing machinery was all imported from. Sometimes the paper runs out and they can't get access to the paper. And there have been a number of times where emergency shipments of paper have come into the country, etc. Yeah, so at the most basic level, if we're going to say what is the ultimate limit to the financing of the military, and we get down to these basic items of printing plates and paper.
that this is so far beyond the notes that I had. You have actually stunned me. I had no idea that a situation this fundamentally I mean, I don't even have the vocabulary for this, because this is not vulnerable. This is not precarious. This is begging for disaster. I, I am genuinely and truly surprised that Myanmar has not yet experienced hyperinflation, and a complete loss of faith in the currency. Like, how have they managed with this level of gross mismanagement and negligence? How have they managed to avoid the complete and total collapse of faith in the economy?
Well, I think the one thing that has always got the military through and the rulers of Myanmar through is that in the end you've got subsistence, right? So you're not going to go below that, and you've got multiple local economies. So people will produce goods in Myanmar to survive, right? So people will produce food and they'll exchange their production with each other. So whenever Myanmar's in one of its really down periods, which it is at the moment, you'll see things hit that floor and economic activity can still go on. Where the monetary aspects and faith in institutions, and again, money being the most basic institution of all, where that starts to matter is that area of economic activity beyond subsistence into the sort of transformational growth, investment, some sort of projection into the future. Because when we think about it, money is really just a projection into the future. It's a bit of paper that you have now that says that you can consume in the future. So, a monetary unit is a little bit of a time traveling instrument. And as that becomes doubtful, it starts to impact on those future projections of economic activity, of which, the most important is investment, right? So you put money down now with a view to earning into the future. That's what gets damaged to the sort of instability that we're talking about. But Myanmar, because of the economy and the actually topography of the place, the soils, the rivers, it's incredibly productive. I mean, it should be much more productive agriculturally, but that's always put a baseline that the economy tends to bounce down to and then bounce along during terrible times like we're experiencing now. But the damage is done at that higher level, at that transformational level, and it's why I think the economy is in such poor state at the moment. And of course we can see that too, that the monetary disarray comes from the fact that people don't save in the JAT. Nobody saves in the JAT. If you're rich enough, you'll have gold, you'll have foreign currency, you'll store your wealth overseas. If you're poor enough, you'll store it in food, or you won't store it at all. You'll be living day to day. But I think, to me, the JAT holds up as a unit of exchange, as a means of exchange at a fairly basic level. But as soon as you start going beyond basic levels, and particularly start thinking about where do people and how do people store their wealth, nobody uses the JAT to store their wealth.
But so, what you were talking about before, you were saying, like, well, people create things. There's a baseline of economic activity. People make stuff, and they can trade that. That's bartering. You're talking about bartering. That's something that we see when people have already completely lost faith in the economy. Like, I'm thinking of hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, hyperinflation in post World War II Hungary. I'm thinking about, or post World War One, hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. Like, those cases where people say, well, I have a lot of like paper banknotes that I can wallpaper my house with, but more importantly, I have a basket of eggs and I can trade the basket of eggs to get some petrol from my neighbor. Like, is that what we're talking about? That's the fallback in Myanmar's case?
Yeah, so that's right. There's a couple of aspects to that, to this as well. Some of the extreme examples of hyperinflation that have happened around the world have come in places where the state itself is collapsing. And the thing about hyperinflation, of course, is it builds on itself and it just quickly accelerates. So we're still short of that. So I'm not suggesting that there is hyperinflation in Myanmar. But we see some of the other aspects that are equivalent to hyperinflation, which again is this lack of faith in fundamental institutions and currency avoidance, right? So I think what we can say about Myanmar is large parts of the economy are not denominated in the JAT. And again, at the low level that we're talking about here, at the basic level that most people function as, there's just so much of Myanmar's economy which is non-monetary. And then at the higher levels, it happens in different ways. It's not the JAT that is the monetary unit that we're dealing with. The other thing is just to say too that the profound inequality in Myanmar also tends to, or has tended to, avoid hyperinflation, because those notes which are being printed hand over fist, as we've been talking about, doesn't usually end up in the hands of most of the population. So it's quite narrow in its function. And so for that reason alone, you don't get that excessive demand of people with lots of notes against many less goods, which delivers hyperinflation. So you've got an economy that's sort of divided up into different spaces that only act and only enacted through foreign currencies. You've got spaces that are essentially barter, as you mentioned earlier, and then you've got other spaces where the JAT is very much the means of exchange, but it's the volume issued is not sufficient across the overall economy to tip it into hyperinflation. The other thing, I think that hyperinflation is often masked a little bit in Myanmar just simply through the non-purchase of goods. Okay, so again, even though there is plenty of JATs around, they're not in the hands of enough people to deliver hyperinflation. So in other words, people just go without. So there's still this demand supply problem, but it's manifested not so much in hyperinflation, but by simply people not being able to buy anything.
Because that was the other question that I wanted to ask on that. Because when you just have the printing press, and I think the technical term for this is quantitative easing, but basically just printing money, that obviously reduces the value of the money that you have. But how much of that is mechanical, which is an unavoidable mathematical outcome of what you've done, and how much of that is psychological, which is people responding to what they think is going to happen? If people don't know about the double printings of currency, if they don't know about an extra couple of billion that were generated and then put into a warehouse, does that mask the inflationary effect of printing that money? Or is it going to come around eventually because that money is going to be spent on something somewhere somehow?
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question. And the two interact with each other. There is a mechanical aspect and there's a psychological aspect that I think history would show is much more important. So the mechanical aspect, again, because Myanmar's economy is segmented in so many ways, um, the mechanical aspect itself is not enough to lead to the hyperinflation. It's the lack of faith that really becomes the issue. Once people start to demand ever more currency units for whatever product that they have on sale, whether it be a bag of rice or coffee or whatever. That's the critical junction once you make that journey into that area. So yeah, the mechanical aspect of it can be avoided for a long period of time. And in fact, I mean, without getting too wonkish about this, economists are much less confident than they used to be about these mechanical aspects. Probably many people listening to this will remember the doctrine known as monetarism, which basically had a very strict relationship between money supply growth and inflation. And one of the things we've experienced down the decades since monetarism came up in the 70s was a breakdown in that relationship. So the mechanical one is not really the important one. The important one is, in fact, that faith in those foundational monetary units.
So as long as the military is able to keep a lid on how much money they're making and how much money they're spending, presumably on buying a whole bunch of military hardware that they're not supposed to have, they're not actually damaging the economy as much as we would see in a Western country doing the same thing, but announcing how much they've generated.
Yeah, and sometimes the damage is disguised as well, because the other way that the military finances itself, of course, is in an even more basic way than printing money, which is they just take stuff, right? So they just extract physically resources. They send the troops out into the field without giving them food and so on, and tell them to live off the land, which, of course, as we know, just means preying upon farmers, etc. So the military does a lot of that direct extraction. So we don't have to worry about taxation policies, and we don't even have to worry about printing notes if soldiers can simply turn up in a village at the point of a gun and extract real resources. So that's also a critical thing. The other thing, of course, we need to think of in all of this, which is absolutely important, and which shapes so much of the conversation about Myanmar at the moment, is what the military desperately want is foreign currency. Because foreign suppliers of arms, they don't want JATs. No one, the people in Myanmar don't necessarily want JATs for all the reasons that we've mentioned, but nobody overseas does. And so they need the foreign exchange to buy what they need to buy. So we must always remember that when I talk about no limits to monetary finance or to military financing within Myanmar, of course that doesn't begin to tell the story internationally, and hence the incredible sensitivity to things like international sanctions and the like.
Absolutely, but I think in terms of what the military is doing today, as in post coup, we might leave that for another day because I'm conscious of your time. But with regards to what's going on before, the obsession with foreign currency, particularly the US dollar, is quite rampant in Myanmar. It has been for a long time. But at the same time, we saw policies being passed, at least under the NLD regime, when I was living there. I remember policies being passed saying that people have to be paid in Jat. They can't be paid in US dollars anymore. Um, and that, I don't know whose policy, whether that was a military initiative or whether that was the government's initiative, but that there seems to be a desire to move away from foreign currencies. So what was happening there?
That's right. So here you've got a real dilemma in the reform area, because in most countries around the world, economic activity is done in the local currency. So I'm talking from Australia, and if I went to a shop just here in Sydney and I presented a US dollar, probably a couple of shops would accept it, but most wouldn't. It would be too much hassle. They would have to go to a bank and exchange it into Australian dollars, because it's Australian dollars that they need to pay their employees, to pay their taxes, to pay the rent, all that sort of stuff. So for most countries, having the domestic currency unit is absolutely critical. It allows government to conduct policy, basically, and do all the things that it needs to do, from financing hospitals, schools, roads, blah blah blah, the whole thing. You need a currency unit. And of course, we then got that concept of legal tender. So most countries declare that their own currency unit is legal tender, which essentially just defines it as a unit that the government will accept for taxes. So and so you get a basic value of the currency for that reason. People have to pay their taxes in something. Therefore, that something has an initial foundational value, and then that value item then can be used to conduct all the business of a country. So creating a local currency is basic and fundamental, but it's a little bit of a dilemma, because it does have that aspect of what then do you ban? If you're in a country where there has been such a loss of faith in the local currency that people are not using it, then governments then are in a real dilemma, and their ability to do things become really hampered, because obviously the government of Myanmar can't print US dollars. Well, not legally anyway. But it can print its own currency, and it can establish its own currency unit. So creating a domestic currency space is a basic economic function of government, no matter what the government is. But it does mean that a country like Myanmar, government comes in and it finds a large part of the economy is not monetized in its domestic currency unit. It's got to try to think, well, how can we change this? How can we function as a proper government? How can we raise money to, again, do the good stuff, education, health, blah, blah, blah? How can we do that if we don't have control over the monetary unit? So they've got to try to fix that. Now, the best way you can do it is by running really good economic policies, not printing too much money, having a good and fair and seen to be fair taxation system, having all the checks and balances of government that allow you to build up confidence in the whole macroeconomic framework. That's the best way to do it. But of course, all of that's going to take time and history and people's memory, and that's the basis of long-term institutional change. But along the way, it may be necessary at times to say that some activities can't be dealt with in foreign exchange. Now, but you're absolutely right about the directives that came from the central bank about paying in local currency. That was certainly the case. With my hat on, I tend to be someone who argues my default answer to every question is that greater freedom is better than less freedom. So it wouldn't be a policy that and wasn't a policy that I supported, but I understand where it's coming from. from again that area of profound distrust in the local currency. So it's a part of a number of sort of policy items you could use to try to build up value in the local currency, but it wouldn't be the one that I would prefer.
Fair enough. But nevertheless, this showed a pretty major shift in the economic policy in the country. Now, how enforceable this was, I mean, that's obviously a very different question. This is a largely cash economy country. I definitely continue to be paid in US dollars. I know a lot of my colleagues and a lot of people in my circle continue to be paid in US dollars because at the end of the day, there are a lot of people who just foreigners, I mean, who will refuse to work if you're paying them in local currency because it's not considered to be stable and it's a hassle to exchange and so on. So this is another element. How much of the policies, how much of the reforms were readily enforceable in a country that was, especially pre-COVID, so very, very heavily dependent on cash transactions?
Yeah, no, it's again another area where reform is just really, really tough. And you're absolutely right. My experience was the same, is that enforcement of these directives very much lagged behind the overall policy directive. And again, it's just one of those things that's just going to take a lot of time, if at all. And just to, in this area, Myanmar is not, such a special case. So if you go around all of Southeast Asia, but everywhere around the world, basically, there are many, many countries where, of course, dollarization, meaning in this case the readily acceptance of the US dollar, particularly as a unit for saving, is really, really common. And it's just I'm not sure if it's ever going to be eradicable, to be honest, except perhaps if there was a safe, stable Bitcoin unit developed, by which I don't mean current Bitcoin, perhaps, but something like it, so it's very common, but it does limit the government and its ability to finance itself. So most governments around the world try to do something about it, and there are heavy-handed ways about it and lighter-handed ways about it. And as I say, I certainly go for the latter rather than the former.
Fair enough. And so, in sort of wrapping up the part of the discussion that's pre-coup, it seems that the ball was definitely rolling. Economic reforms were definitely happening, and reforms not just to the economy but to the infrastructure, the civil service. And so, do you feel that the military felt the pinch? Do you feel that the military were genuinely concerned for the future of the country, which is to say, the concern for their own futures within a country that's economically developing, or do you think that the military felt that they could just weather this storm?
No, I think they really did feel under threat. 2021 was going to be a critical year in so many areas, particularly in banking and some things related to that. So finally, some of the reforms were starting to bear fruit and some real deadlines coming up. And in my view, they were definitely feeling the pinch. Which is not to say I don't want to get all economic determinist about this, or even reform determinist, because there were lots of other things, of course, going on at the Myanmar side that were, more important in many ways, including just individual factors relating to, the leadership of the military. But I do think that the reforms were part of the broader trigger for the military feeling more defensive, if you like, and getting a mindset that they wanted this particular train to stop. So even though I suspect that there were more important factors and there were more immediate triggers as well, but I do think this general direction had the military worried.
And so you talk about 2021 being a very big year. Obviously, none of that comes to pass because of the coup of February. But what what do you think would have happened? Like if all of the deadlines that were planned for 2021 are met, everyone is compliant with the requirements and the requests and the directives that have been set out, and everything is sort of on track with regard to the reforms. End of 2021 with no coup, what do you think Myanmar would be looking at?
Well, so I'm realistic enough to know that it's going to be better, but not still transformed. So I mentioned, 2021 as a key year for the reforms, but having lived in the place right through that reform period, I'm realistic enough to know that some of these deadlines would have moved and things not, gone according to plan. But I think it would have been better, there would the incremental aspect to the reforms would have continued. It would have been bolder. One of the things that, of course, we'll never know now, but the second term of the NLD government was going to be bolder in the economic areas. A new set of reform measures have been drawn up, and people were extremely excited about them. On top of those key deadlines that I mentioned earlier. So we expected an acceleration of reforms. In reality, we'd have got maybe, I don't know, just top of my head, say half of what we wanted, maybe not even 25%. But it would have been a better place. The economy would have been that bit better than it had been before. I think the momentum would have been better. I think the COVID outcome would have been dramatically better, because amongst those new economic policies that were on their way was a package of issues to deal with COVID, because of course that was running at the time. So this big new reboot of the reform program included a very comprehensive approach to COVID. And so we wouldn't have seen that disaster, because, the massive damage that did to Myanmar's economy, even in addition to the coup, but of course connected with it, given the incredible venality and incompetence of the regime of dealing with that. So the country just would have been, in my way of thinking, even being, really realistic about it, it just would have been immeasurably better than it turned out to be. But it wouldn't have been a utopia. It would still have been a struggle. There would still been complaints. A lot of the maladies would have still been there, but a lot of them would have been just that little bit better.
I think that's a slightly more optimistic note than we usually have on this platform. So I thank you for that hypothetical indulgence. I'm conscious of your time, so I think we can sort of conclude around here, and we can come back at a later date, hopefully, and we can discuss what was going on with economic reforms during COVID and what has been going on economically, both on the NUG side and the military side, later, post coup. But as is convention, and I happen to know that you listen to the show, so hopefully you're aware of this part. We like to end by giving the guest the opportunity to address the audience directly and share some thoughts for the audience to just consider and mull over as they go on about their day. So I'd like to invite you to share some thoughts with our audience now.
Well, probably my overwhelming thought, given that I know so many people from Myanmar listen to this, is just to express my profound gratitude to the people of Myanmar. Obviously, I spent time in prison and all that, but that was of no fault to the Myanmar people, as opposed to the regime that rules over and exploits them. And I experienced just the most extraordinary kindness, compassion, and courage at the hands of people in a much worse position than this privileged foreigner talking now. And so, my overall message to the listeners of this podcast, I suppose, is not to give up hope. The raw material of Myanmar is its people, and I think that raw material is of the highest quality. So that's probably my most important message that I'd like to get across, and the way that people have supported me, both during the time in the prison, but since coming out and all that, the lovely messages I've received, I do think that it's there, and we just, in a better political environment, Myanmar could be a profoundly better place, and a better place of the sort that its people just so profoundly deserve.
We want to take a moment to introduce you to our nonprofit Better Burma's online shop, which features handicrafts sourced from artisan communities scattered throughout Myanmar. Far from being mass-produced knockoffs, the pieces we offer are unique and handmade, reflecting the wide diversity of different peoples found throughout the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving from democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country. When Myanmar experienced its transition period, moving towards democracy in the late 2010s after decades of harsh military dictatorship, many Burmese craftspeople hoped their beautiful work could finally be appreciated beyond the country's borders. But sadly, this was not to be so. Following the military coup, many skilled artisans suddenly found all possibility of continuing their livelihood closed off and began struggling just to feed their families. With this in mind, we prioritize working with artisans from disadvantaged and vulnerable backgrounds because we know just how hard it can be to survive at the margins of society in Myanmar. This includes such people as those with disabilities, mothers who have contracted HIV/AIDS, civil servants on CDM, ethnic and religious minorities, and more. To view these wonderful pieces, please visit alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S, one word, alokacrafts.com. Otherwise, please consider a donation through our usual channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam